Welcome to episode 127, Introducing a Field Manual for Military Parents, a review for practitioners working with military-connected families, featuring Dr. Alan Scheuermann, licensed clinical psychologist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and today we are going to be talking about supporting military parents. I am very interested in this topic and delighted to be joined by Dr. Alan Scheuermann. He is a child, adolescent, and family psychologist and has worked exclusively with military families during his career. And he's actually joining us today from Guam because that's part of his story, is being part of the military. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Scheuermann.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me here.
So, Alan, why don't you take a minute and tell us a bit about your background and how you came to have this particular specialization of working with military families?
Well, when I was looking forward to graduate school, I picked Georgia State University because it had family in the title of the program. Most child programs, clinical programs, had just child clinical psychology. Georgia State was the only one in the country at the time, some many decades ago, that had family in the program, in the title. And so that was an emphasis on systemic contextual aspects. And I really wanted to include that as part of my career. And so that was an important lens through which I see things. However, shortly after graduation, getting my PhD and licensed, I had an opportunity to have a position in Germany to work with military families overseas. Took that in 1999, and it's where I have built my career. Lived most of my life working with in and around military bases. Mostly overseas and in remote locations. So I've had a unique aspect of working with them in unique locations. Germany, I did come back to the States, Fort Campbell for a couple years, went back to Germany, and then now have found myself in this interesting place of Guam, where it's got a pretty heavy military population.
So I'm curious, how do you come from a military family, or was this?
My dad was in the military, but he left the military way before I was born, but it was always part of my background. Would sit and watch World War II movies with my dad. That was one of the ways that we connected. But when it got to the point in time where I was of age, he was absolutely not a good fit for me. I don't think I would have done well in the military. The kind of skills that military members have are pretty impressive, to be able to put up with a lot of things and a lot of personal pressures and be still dedicated to the mission. I was much too empathic and emotional for that, but have a deep respect for service, the deep respect for a higher calling, and many people join the military for that purpose, to do something way beyond themselves and to serve their country, to serve others, and to do good in the world in a very different way than I might have identified it at the time, but now have come to deeply respect it and appreciate it. Also, both my grandparents were in World War I as well. So long time ago they served. So there's, again, deep intergenerational connection.
And I would imagine for many of our listeners that that's also true. I know for me, my grandparents and uncles as well also served in the military. My mom was what she will proudly say, a military brat. Mm-hmm. So I have, while I wasn't raised as a military brat, have absolutely had the exposure and reverberations of what it meant to lose my grandfather in service, and things like that. So I'm actually very excited for this topic,
Gotcha.
And I'm sure our listeners are as well, because so many of us come from families that have military histories.
For sure.
So let's start there. What can you tell me about military families that distinguishes them from civilian families?
Before we get fully started, I do, because I'm have to put out a disclaimer. Sorry, I didn't say this earlier. The disclaimer is that any content I present is solely my own and not representing any viewpoint or conclusion that the Department of Defense or the government has put out there. So this is just my thoughts, my feelings, and represents me as a professional over time, and nothing with the Department of Defense. I think one of the things that I've come to recognize about military families over time, and both in my reading of the research, but also just hearing the stories of families, is that the military families really, they're no different than civilian families as far as the people themselves. I mean, they're people. So people are people. General rules apply, general principles of human behavior, human interaction, vulnerabilities as well as strengths, and they're the same. So that's one of the things that I would, I guess, try to emphasize here is we're talking about people. But one of the things that is interesting about military families is that they live and work within probably the most diverse organizational structure and one of the diverse populations of a workforce and a community. The U.S. military attracts people from around the world, not just citizens. There are people from every single continent except Antarctica. They don't hire penguins yet. But I've worked with people from Asia, from Africa, Europe, Australia, all who wear the United States military uniform. Every different background that you can think of is represented. So that is one of the unique distinctions. Most people live and work in relatively uniform type settings, or with some minor variation, but that's a critical distinction to make. Also, though, they're maybe one of the most mobile communities. They're moving around all the time, and we'll get into more of the implications to that. But that's a distinction. Another distinction, too, is that I kind of realized that, oh, wait, I'm working with a population that everyone has a job. Civilian families, you go work in a community and not everyone would have a job. You might have homeless or unemployed or groups of, particularly now, through COVID, one of those things is that everyone had a steady income through this whole thing. So that's an important distinction to make through all of the ups and downs. If you're in the military, you have a job. But then also, one of the interesting things about mobility that distinguishes military families from civilian families is the separation from extended family. I read an article in the New York Times that came up, and it really struck me that the majority of American adults live within 45 minutes of their mother. Wow, I live in Guam.
And your mom does not.
My mom does not live in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. She's in St. Louis. And so, and if I look around at most of the people that I talk with, they are way more. They are thousands of miles away from their parent, not 45. And even though America has become more mobile over time, this is still a statistic that holds true. And that 45 miles is in Nevada, in the western region, not in the Northeast, where it's down to, I think, somewhere around 23 miles or something like that. And so that is one of the distinguishing aspects of it. But along with that, though, they are automatically part of this network of a larger family of the military. Whatever branch they're in or whatever, they have people who, as soon as you say, I'm a military family, and someone else says, I am too, there can be an immediate connection. Another thing is that based on status, based on your connection to this organization, military families have dedicated resources to them. There's a variety of resources that they can provide because the government wants to give resources to this population. So that's an important thing to consider, as well as having guaranteed health care. There's I talk to other colleagues in which their civilian population does not have health care, or it's difficult, they have to pay out of pocket. This is all available to them. So that is something to identify. But I think maybe in the civilian sector there are subpopulations in which the jobs are inherently risky. But for the military, every job is inherently risky. Like in the Army, every person is first a rifleman. I don't care if you're personnel, wherever, you need to be prepared to fire a weapon in combat, should it come to that. If you're on a ship, it doesn't matter if you're a cook or whatever, you are on the front lines, regardless of your combat role. Air Force, the same. You may be at a base, but you could be long away. So there is inherent risk. So that's just a physical risk aspect of these things. But also, parents are frequently absent, much more so than your average civilian sector job. Absent for unpredictable times, lengths of time, lots of things. So that adds some stressors. And then there are fewer there are fewer single parents than the civilian population as well, based on the demands of the military, even though the divorce rate may be higher. People are more quickly to remarry within the military. I'm not exactly sure why that is. There's a lot of hypotheses why. But just know that is one of those aspects, is that there are fewer sets of families with just single parents.
That's a lot of information that you just presented.
Sure.
And I'm trying to process it. And so military families and just exposure in the workplace. So you said more diverse, they tend to be more mobile,
Mm-hmm.
more folks are employed. So the people you're seeing in your office have stable employment, as you mentioned, healthcare access, and that separation from extended family. That last part, like that separation from extended family, I would imagine has a huge impact on the development of community within military systems. Can you speak a little bit about that and kind of the chosen family, if you will, that would occur in military families?
Actually, there's some interesting information out there and hypotheses that a woman by the name of Lynn Hall, who used to be a counselor at DoDEA, Department of Defense Education Activity School overseas, now a civilian counselor, but wrote about there being 5 types of families in the military. One, of course, is your nuclear family. The people you have around you. You have your extended family, who are beyond, obviously, the ones who are distant. But then you have your military unit. Every unit owns their people. Of course, people come in and out all the time, but part of leadership training is to say you own your people and you develop a sense of connectedness and family just by status in that unit. And there are things such as in the Army, the family resource group. So often spouses or people connected to that military member will develop a parallel family resource group that's attached to that unit to provide support for dependents who come in there. And so that can be seen as a family by status rather than necessarily chosen. But then you have neighborhood families. So wherever you find yourself located, then often your family becomes part of who you run into in the neighborhood. Who do you live next to? Who's your apartment or suite neighbor, house neighbor, those kinds of things. And also, if you're living on base, there are usually responsibilities that they have for upkeep, and so there's a little bit of a group of someone who leads the upkeep and policing of the neighborhood lawns, making sure, almost like a OHA, but as or a homeowners group. But so it's a neighborhood group. But then in general, a branch. So the service branch becomes your larger family. I'm a Navy family. I'm an Army or Air Force or Coast Guard family. And so then you have this connectedness to this branch. So those are different families that you could get connected to. But again, the frequent moves create stresses in how quickly do you engage and how deeply do you feel connected to them, and how real are those families. You know, you're away from your extended family. How can you really utilize them as a resource if you're 3,000 miles, 5,000 miles away from them. Your nuclear family becomes much more important, and everything that happens in there becomes it's almost like a crucible of stress. Not just they rely on each other strongly, but when something goes wrong, it can be really destabilizing because they're the only ones who move around with each other. The military unit can have conflict, right? Any job. You throw a bunch of people together, and any stress in that military unit, if you don't feel connected to that, or you're maybe the target of some hazing, or whatever, you don't rank in status, then that can be distressing. Or if somehow you don't connect naturally with those folks in your neighborhood, you can be isolated. And so, even though there are all these potential areas of connection, there are multiple layers of potential isolation that are different from in a military family than a civilian family. Those include geographic, that we've already been talking about. Social isolation, just I'm not connected to these people. I don't have deep connections. And again, that goes into kind of emotional isolation. The more frequently I move, the less likely I am to develop deeper connections. I may pretend to get deeper, but I'm tired of continuing to find new connections over time. But then there's cultural isolation too. If you are in a stable location through your life, you develop community that is more culturally aligned with yourself. And when you're in a diverse group, a diverse organization, and you're moving around a lot, it may be harder to find that cultural connectedness over time. And so those are the 4 levels of isolation, or varieties of isolation, that can, I think providers need to be sensitive to.
I can hear that then the importance on the nuclear family, again, being consistent in weathering those changes together, and then also the branch at large as being a major source of connection and identity when there are all these other changes, like you mentioned about moving areas. So when we zoom in through families and look really at the parenting, there are really unique challenges experienced by military parents.
Yeah.
And we'll get to military kids, but can you start by talking about kind of the challenges that military parents face?
Well, just structurally, because their work demands are pretty high, they have to worry about their care plan. Now, that's not unique, obviously, because civilians have to do that all the time. However, the nature of their job is that they don't have necessarily set schedules. The mission comes first for military families and the military member, and so they may be so instead of an 8-hour day or 9-hour day or a 10-hour day, sometimes it could be 12, 14, 15, whatever. And if there's a brief push taskers that come on, it's not necessarily planned. It's unpredictable what the demands of that. So having a flexible care plan, not just a care plan for their children, is really critical. And military missions are no fail. So the pressure is not a lot of forgiveness if that mission comes through that you have to show up. So that balance of what the pressures of the job are and how do I care for my children are there.
When you say no fail, for people that aren't familiar with what that means, can you talk more about like the concept of no fail?
Well, no fail. Military missions are life or death. They are national security. And the leadership basically says, if our country is asking us to do this, then we cannot fail.
And good luck finding care for your kindergartner.
Yes, and exactly. We need you. And so that means how you care for your family is related to the mission and readiness. It's not just about improving your profit margin. I think that's the distinction that I think a lot about with the mission, is that existential and duty to country, truly existential issue, is kind of a cultural factor within the military that is not typically seen in most civilian sector positions. So again, being separate from children is a burden on parents as well. that significant separation from your extended family, worrying about how being separate from my extended family, grandma, grandpa, etc., how that might affect my children, worrying about how to support children through every single new transition, moving from time to time, that stressor on a parent about, transitioning, and you'll hear the term PCS. It's called a permanent change of station. When's your PCS date? Permanent change of station. People are thinking about that constantly. When are my orders? When am I going to move? And all of these things. How am I going to address my educational challenges with my children through this move? And so those are all these different challenges that are going on in a parent's mind. Think about this. If a military parent has 20 years in service, often people want that goal of retiring from the military because there are benefits from that. That usually hits at 20 years. A family is going to go through at least 6 moves. I mean, the average number of moves for a civilian family is much less than that. And if they move, they may move within the same community as opposed to be in 3 or 4 different continents through that history.
So for those of us who are civilians, when it comes to being given a permanent change of station, how much warning on average do parents have, do people in general have to know, okay, now I'm going to pick up and we're moving wherever it is?
When you arrive in a new location, you know the term that you're generally slated to be there. So it's a predictable transition. But about a year before your next transition, you start putting in selections for your next duty station. 6 months, you hope to get not orders, but at least the location of where you're going. And then you start the wait for orders. And so while predictable, there are a lot of variables that go on that are levels of anxiety that are in the background of a family's life. So there's that just ambient anxiety about when is the next move, or where are we actually going to go, or exactly what date, So, and often it could be in April, not summertime. These moves are not planned for a children's educational progress. So that there may be challenges with regard to transitioning from one school to another and how that relates to the accrual of credits in high school or whatever.
I'm imagining for parents and also then for the kids, these waves of grief and anticipatory grief, finding new relationships, pulling back from relationships, kind of a self-protective cocooning to try to prepare for the next transition, and just these, as you said, kind of continual sources of anxiety.
Oh, well, yeah, and that kind of relates to the children's stressors, because we're talking about parent stressors and their concerns for the kids and the things that they have to think about. But the kids, while they're going through normal development and have a variable set of cognitive and emotional skills to deal with each new stressor, they're having to deal with these pileup of losses. And there's good research from, again, pileup of stressors over time that results in vulnerability to things such as anxiety disorder or aggression or those kinds of things, because unresolved loss over time, and if they pile up fast and quick and over time at different developmental levels, can play out into problematic behaviors and emotional adjustment.
So for kids that are in that position, what are the protective factors when they're exposed to loss after loss, changing schools again, changing friend groups?
I think intentionality, intentionality of parents in guiding that. There is a resource that I'll talk about at the end, but Military Child Education Coalition has a lot of support for transitioning and a lot of guidance for how to support kids and help prepare kids for those transitions. This is one of the things that is actually fairly well known about military kids, and so there's a lot of effort to try to help kids be more resilient. However, I do think that it's a myth that military kids are quote-unquote more resilient than civilian kids. They're kids. They're just given a greater opportunity to demonstrate resilience or more frequent opportunities to become vulnerable to those stressors, which then relates to the fact that actually there's a 30% At least one time. It's some time ago. Rand Corporation did a study comparing military kids to civilian kids, and that there was a 30% higher rate of anxiety disorders among military kids, as well as a 25% higher rate of behavioral problems than civilian kids. And that's in spite of the protective factors of every parent has a job, healthcare, all those things. I think the stressors of this pileup of transitions on kids plays out in those higher rates of anxiety and behavior disorder.
When you mention that the parents are employed, for most military parents that are in a committed relationship, is their significant other then also in the military? Like, how do you know the rates of like how often you have a military person that is in a long-term relationship with someone who's non-military?
The majority of military families are comprised of a military member with a dependent who is not military. Although there are dual military families, for sure, the stressors on a dual military family are greater because both are committed to the military. Both parents could be sent to duty at the drop of a hat, and then you have to juggle what are the implications of childcare for that. But I think an additional stressor for parents, particularly for the non-military parent, the dependent parent, is that they're often underemployed. They're more transient. They don't get to establish experience in one location, or the job might not be available as soon as they hit a new location so that they could get the highest level that they could. Licensure for nursing, for example, or teaching varies by state, and so reciprocity is not always there. And so you often get people who are underemployed, which is I think a invisible hidden stressor for that dependent parent.
Within the military, I mean, you and I could talk for a very long time about cultural norms and why they're there. Having had service people in my family, married into my family, and in my family history, those norms about how old you are at first marriage being different than the civilian population. And as I say that, you smile. So there are these norms that exist. How do these norms, military culture, impact parenting? And then let's kind of talk about what's different for a family and how they're parenting kids, how kids are growing up, what they're exposed to, what their access to resources might be, things like that.
So, again, within the military culture, I think it attracts different people, and you'd have to go to a recruiter to really break that down. I haven't, that's not something that I have full expertise, but I can tell you that when people get married, because there is support for families in the military, often it's an easier decision to go ahead and get married. It's also because of the transitions. It's harder to stay in a location and develop a relationship over time that would sustain if a person meets an active duty military member. There's only a short window of time that you are going to make a decision whether or not to sustain this until it becomes a long distance one. So somebody's here for 3 years, you meet them 1.5 years into the tour, and then you and they decide this is really important, but you're not quite ready to make a decision. Maybe you make that decision earlier because you're going to move with them. So there's an aspect, again, of that transition that impacts potential decision-making about commitment. So there's some cultural background aspects of that it is normal to be married, and in fact, as opposed to normal, say, in a professional world, to be single for much longer. There is definitely a norm and, to some degree, a cultural benefit to have dependents rather than be single. So, often, even though there's the old military drill sergeant, we didn't issue you a family quote that you might hear in movies. There is some expectation, particularly among officers, but as you rank up, that what is your family doing for the military, not just what are you doing for the military.
Absolutely. And that is a phenomenon that I have watched, having a sibling who was in that position, having married
Right.
into military, and the complexities of that role for a spouse is just very different. And coming from what I'll call a majority civilian family, coming into it going, whoa, like you got a letter for doing what?
Right. And I'll talk about that in a second as well, because of the impact, the potential impact of any of one's dependents on one's military career. That's not going to happen if you work at Walmart or IBM or Apple. Your dependent isn't, nobody's looking at your performance appraisal for what your dependent has done. While that doesn't happen in the military as far as fitness rep report or their evaluations, NCOERs and OERs, those are acronyms. Sorry about performance appraisals within the military. Those are important acronyms to get to know when you work with them, that you will hear these things. I won't belabor as much, but a key part of the military culture, again, I spoke about this before, is the focus on readiness. Even more so now than it was, say, 20 years ago, because of the churn of mission and the efficiency of use of political pressure to have efficient use of military dollars. Readiness is important. And readiness means at the drop of a hat, you are ready to fight tonight, as they say. You're ready to go on the ship, go in the air, be deployed to wherever the military and the country asks you to be. And so readiness includes not just your physical readiness and training and all those things to do your mission, but is your family ready to tolerate your absence? And so that is clear and critical. So anything that happens within the family that takes a military member's time and attention away from their training and their mission could have an impact on their advancement or the location where they serve or their overall fitness for duty. So that there is an occupational impact, potential occupational impact for the overall health of their family.
So effectively what you're talking about is what I would call basically perception of readiness, and what are the factors that are impacting someone's actual readiness.
So, and here's just an example. I have the opportunity to evaluate young kids, and actually throughout the age, on whether or not they have autistic processes. Are they on or can be identified as on the spectrum? Through their development. If I do, and they require a ton of resources additional than a normal outpatient mental health facility can provide, on Guam, we don't have those resources. And the behavioral difficulties are so challenging that it would probably require that military member to spend more time at home supporting the caretaker spouse to be able to address those developmental concerns. So it would require a consideration to relocate to a stateside duty station that would have the resources to support them. So they're not going to kick somebody out because of this, but they are going to relocate someone for the betterment of the readiness of this, let's say it's Air Force airmen, to get to a location so that the resources can support this family's needs, so that airman can safely, effectively do their job and feel at ease to go ahead and do it.
How long does a consideration like that, like the example that you just gave of a child who's on the autism spectrum, you're someplace like Guam that those resources aren't available,
Yeah.
How paralyzing for a parent to need help for your kid, and then also considering the impact on your career, how long does all of that take to play out?
Well, it certainly depends on functioning. You look at the resources that are available to you in whatever location you are and say for how long might we sustain current functioning? When is the next PCS date, as we talked about, permanent change of station date? Do you have orders yet or not? And where are you going to? if within the next year you're going to be PCSing anyway, it probably does not behoove the government to send you just a few months early, because it takes 3 or 4 months to uproot everyone, find them a location that would be in an area that would have those resources, and then physically move that whole family there. So there's a consideration just about practical logistics and timing. But if the needs are so great, it might not matter. Say a child is suicidal, has a severe mental illness that is really requiring or has some impact on safety, and that safety is chronic and difficult to manage in an outpatient basis without, say, a partial hospitalization program or something like that. That could also require a more speedy relocation. And so there are a number of different factors with regard to that, but it's the idea of how much need does your dependent have, and how can we fit that within there, within our resources that we have.
From a family systems perspective, if based on what you've already said, you have some families that if it's a 2-parent home, that there'll be one member that's in the military and one that may have, as you mentioned, kind of more transient in their career, more focused on the home, maybe a stay-at-home parent, quote unquote. For the families that have 2 military members leading the home that are both parents, how do they typically manage childcare and the demands of, I mean, goodness, everything is upside down in the pandemic, let's just laugh as parents. But outside of pandemic life, there are going to be appointments for the dentist. There are going to be, these things that for any parent are challenging, but particularly for military families, how is that different?
Well, the military does provide allowance for that. So, medical appointments are seen as your duty station or your place of duty for the time. So, again, healthcare is related to readiness. And so if you can do good routine healthcare, then you maintain readiness. So there's allowance for that. However, for childcare, there is a clear effort to have a lot of childcare available. Child development centers rolling into school rolling into after. Most bases have a after-school program for school-age kids, and dual military parents get priority for those placements. So there is a fit. When I said earlier there are more resources to help support this, that's exactly one of the reasons for that. However, then when you have dual military and you have more resources to help supplement what the parents provide, then you have greater day-to-day distance, not only greater demand, but also this is the issue, the whole idea of quality time versus quantity time as parenting is, I think, an interesting one, because, even some of the research on parenting suggests that quantity time actually allows for quality to develop rather than you getting quality time on your time, because it's the kid's time in receiving it that where quality comes, not what your intent is at the time as a parent.
Ooh. Can you say that again? That was really powerful.
So quality time is not based on your intent as a parent that I'm going to do quality time now because it's convenient for me. Quality time emerges from quantity of being with your child, because then the child is more ready to receive it when it emerges.
You just crushed every parent's heart during the pandemic, Alan.
Sorry.
I know. So, knowing that every parent has had a slew of challenges during the pandemic, unrelated to military life, but then potentially layered on top of, that's a really challenging concept that you just brought up. And so it sounds like then if you have these dual military parents, that finding quality time becomes that much more difficult.
I think we focus, and one of the things that I've learned is, as far as diagnosis of conditions versus looking at context to explain challenging behavior or difficult patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving, is that a diagnosis identifies a thing within a person, right? Whereas a contextual view says a diagnosis may explain something to direct treatment, but may not identify the real cause. And one of the things that I They're not completely illogical. Now, autism, yes, you got a clear, more developmental, structural type of challenge in which kids are neurally atypical versus typical, right? So there's a structure there. But for things like depression, anxiety, emotional adaptation, behavioral patterns that are difficult, we often fail to look at the pile up of stressors and the context of the relationships that the kids have developed over time as part of those causes of challenges. And I think attachment, parenting, and the idea of early attachment but ongoing attachment within the military is something to always consider as a factor because of these external strains and other elements of isolation beyond the nuclear family that we have to pay attention to. Were parents deployed during a child's early first couple of years of life? How much stress occurred during that to potentially disrupt that early attachment that can then later explain why a kid isn't listening to a parent? Do you, instead of orient yourself around tactically and I'll get to that in a second, do you orient yourself around more of a recouping your attachment versus a strict behavioral plan? What is the quality of the relationship systemically based on that history?
Said every family therapist ever, like in what you just said, of like that idea of like, well, my child should behave, and the therapist is like, well, how is your relationship?
For sure.
Yeah, like they're not listening to me. Well, how are things going?
So we're kind of getting into what I think is going to be really the guts of. So okay, here are all the challenges for parents, right? Here are all the challenges in military culture. What are aspects of culture that might relate to how you then implement things as parents? How might we advise parents? How might we help them organize themselves? Some of the culture of the military, though, is important to know, is that they're really focused on practical matters, action-oriented, results-oriented. Duty is important. So getting things done often is, people want to join the military because they want to accomplish things, not because they want to think about a lot of things, and every branch of the military has clear standards of behavior that are outlined and taught. And yet it's happening within a idea of what the term respect means. And often respect is authoritarian or more autocratic in nature within the military structure because following orders is a potential life or death issue, not does it make sense? And so there's a lot of top-down authoritarian aspect or autocratic aspect of that culture, but respect is the authority should get respect just by nature of that. But this doesn't mean that military parents are more rigid, but there's this culture of practicality, of standards of behavior, of respect, of following orders, of accomplishing things. And so that is something to be aware of when you're trying to advise parents of what to do. But I also think that in the military, there's a lot of skepticism about mental health in the military. I think in part because a lot of military members are subject to that occupational health fitness for duty issue as well, and readiness. If I show a weakness per se, and I air quote that, depending on what I say to a psychologist or a social worker or a psychiatrist, if I'm trying to get some help, if I say something that concerns them, I might all of a sudden be restricted from some level of duty, and that could potentially affect my career. So there's some skepticism about how mental health is utilized, and often it's seen as, tree hugger, overly sensitive, all those kinds of things as opposed to action oriented. So there's that kind of culture of mixed feelings, if you will, or ambivalence about the use of mental health.
Well, and at least what I've seen is and I use this term with flexibility, but almost a weaponization of mental health in careers that these things are really closely evaluated. So even if you're non-military, if you are a pilot, these are important considerations. If you're a police officer, certain jobs have these kind of occupational demands that are very different and can really make or break a career, and that's a whole lot of pressure to put on somebody. And the other thing I was thinking when you were talking about kind of the sensitivity, there may be a mismatch between parenting in the kind of top-down military model and a child, for example, who's highly sensitive. So that difficulty too, and speaking as a highly sensitive person with a highly sensitive kid, like, I don't know how I would do in a military home because that I have big feelings.
Right. For sure. And I talk with tons of people who have kids who have big feelings, and they're not quite sure how to handle them because they learn discipline in the military, say and you just do what you're told. And so that's there. So what I'd like to do is outline how I've found success in joining with military members and how I've understood their thinking. And ultimately, in the military, basically we have the standards of behavior. You have standards of conduct that is written out by instruction. These are orders that you will abide by, and these are required for regarding how you operate within the workforce to meet the mission. And then there are clear sanctions for not following those. Obviously, in real practice, there are lots of variations because there is sexual harassment that does occur in the military, and that is obviously violating the standards of behavior, the core values, those kinds of things. But there are core values that those are judged against, for sure. It's not just a legal structure outside. So standards of behavior are based on core values, and I'll give you a set of core values that are in the Army. They're called leadership values, but it's LDRSHIP. Army, Navy, culture of acronyms, for sure. Definitely.
Alphabet soup.
Absolutely. So, L is loyalty, D, duty, R, respect, S, selfless service, H, honesty and humility. Humility was recently added. I, integrity, and P, personal courage. So that's a really interesting set of values that is a filter for military members when they're evaluating their performance or other people's performance. And these are actually written out on evaluation reviews. How do they live? How does this military member live up to or embody these values? And so it's something that is part of their daily consideration. And I always quibble with selfless service because that's hard to be selfless in service because you need a self to be able to serve. But on top of those, then the military has a set of really an overall mission. So the overall mission is ready to do the nation's business, no matter where, no matter what. But then there are specific strategic missions that are then assigned. So what is your goal for this action? But then you develop a battle plan to address that strategic mission. And then there are rules of engagement. And those rules of engagement are then the tactics that you implement your battle plan with. And so you have standard range of tactics, what is in and outside bounds of appropriateness. There was a big discussion about torture a decade and a half ago and waterboarding and things like that. So that could be what is a tactic to accomplish a mission. But then there are situational and mission-driven, strategic goal-driven tactics. Occupying territory could include some tactics that winning hearts and minds would work against. And so you have to identify what are your tactics for what your goal is. So all military members get that framework. That's what they live and breathe every day. That's what they're trained to do. And so when I've been able to use that framework to then put parenting ideas into, they then learn evidence-based tactics about how to parent well. Most of the mistakes occur when we focus as parents or advising parents to do this tactic, or that tactic. But they fail to look at the overall, what is this family's overall mission? What are their standards of behavior? What are they focused on? And how can we organize it around that first so that they have something upon which they can choose tactics that may work for them as a unique family?
So basically, it's taking the framework of a family mission statement, effectively, and expanding it using comfortable, familiar military terms and theories to join with a family and present information in a way that may be particularly digestible because it's their marinade.
I think it's more than just joining. I think joining is really important, but joining allows for them to receive this and say it makes sense. And so then what this becomes is a framework for them to implement the tactics that we're then advising them to do. And the whole approach, quite frankly, it's a whole a structure of almost like a manual for doing parenting over time, over the life of your children's lives, over the 20-year career that you have, through all of the transitions, so that you can create some stability here with your nuclear family. So if we can make the parenting message consistent with how you live your life anyway, and then help you become more explicit with your family values, your family standards of behavior, and then your overall mission, then you can maintain stability through all of these transitions to help be resilient through them. Yeah, and it's congruent. It fits. It's not clunky like, scream-free parenting or 1, 2, 3 magic, and all of a sudden you're hearing 1, 2, 3 all the time, and kids get it and they start reacting against it because there's an adaptation to that kids have. I do want to acknowledge that there is a military, a parenting prevention program developed for military families that has some good research behind it that incorporates some of this in it. It's not exactly how I've lined it up, but they have done it. It's called Project Focus. There are references in the materials if people want to look that up. But that's focused on prevention as opposed to utilizing it in a one-on-one way to really identify the tactics lined up for problematic behavior that kids may have.
So when you're talking about prevention, are you talking about like behavioral issues with kids? Or are we talking about abuse? Like it sounds like kind of the prevention, early intervention versus what you're talking about, which is almost a framework and the
It is prevention in the sense of population prevention for general problems to help parents become more efficient. So Project Focus basically said, how can we help families become more resilient across transitions? And they found that there was good resilience data when that was implemented versus others. But it really is, for the population, a huge effort, and it's impractical for individual providers to put into place unless there's the structure behind you, and not every base does it. Not every base is trained on it. So again, all the evidence-based practices for parenting advice, positive reinforcement and behavior plans and all of those kinds of things are really important as potential tactics to utilize. However, how I work with parents helps to implement them more efficiently, I think. And often it's the dependent parent, the non-military parent that implements most parenting plans and hears all of these tactics that we do. Obviously, having a unified and consistent approach among the two parents is better than having one parent being carved out to do the parenting and the other one kind of coming in and out with the absences. And so really what I try to do is I try to get both the military member to get more buy-in and use this so that the parenting interventions can be more powerful, because it's not just left to the caretaker parent to implement these things. And in fact, I emphasize the power and the importance of the military parent being engaged, even in spite of their absences, and how being clear and explicit about their values, standards of behavior, mission, etc., that being explicit, what is typically implicit in a family, can actually help those absences not be as painful.
As you're talking about that, I'm thinking for a clinician then working with families or just working with individuals within the family that are military, the challenge for providers then to make sure that you're familiar with enough tactics that meet the demands of that particular challenge, whatever it is. And so I can hear that it's like, well, I'm a therapist and I do this. This is the parenting method, or this is the, systems theory that I use, and the potential mismatch then with a military family and the flexibility that would basically be required by providers to be able to do what you're saying, which is to have kind of this list of options of various tactics and be able to say, well, let's try this one and see if this helps us complete the mission about these. At least in my home, the fight's about bedtime.
Sure. And I think the other aspect of that is that evidence-based practice is as a verb rather than as a noun, as APA identified back in 2006, that it is the integration of good research. What is the other one? The other two. Oh, I didn't anticipate talking about this, but it's good research integrated with good clinical skill and fitting within the framework of the patients, the people who you're working with, their preferences. Loosely stated, those three elements are really important, and it's knowing what the research is that supports them as tactics, but yet being flexible enough to use the ones that fit within the unique patient and within our therapeutic relationship and interaction. And so that's where getting feedback and having flexibility that you're talking about a variety of tactics helps you fit those potential tactics into that unique family's culture.
For our listeners, Alan and I were talking about this before we started recording. We're both trainers in feedback-informed treatment. And so as Alan is talking about this, is hitting a lot of those points that come out of the research by Dr. Barry Duncan and Dr. Scott Miller about the flexibility of therapy and of the therapist, particularly, and openness to feedback to improving outcomes. There's a lot here in what you're saying, and basically applying this different framework that is more adaptable to military families because of the demands of their profession and their lifestyle.
Again, it's a diverse, also extremely diverse workforce. So if I'm going to be working with this group, I need to be as flexible as I can. And if I'm hired to work with a broad range of people, and I'm the only child psychologist on the island of Guam, yes, I see your mouth dropping.
Oh my goodness.
So that includes, there are child providers, but I'm the only specially trained child psychologist on Guam, civilian or military. That means that I have to be flexible to meet that population's needs. I can't be so exclusive that I only do Love and Logic or Scream Free or Magic 1, 2, 3, or whatever, that's my thing. I can't have a thing. I must be flexible in the face of the folks who come. Because ethically, there are not a lot of options for them. So I must use feedback in a clear, consistent, and intentional way to make sure that I'm not making mistakes that otherwise I would have been unaware of.
No pressure.
No, whatever.
Wow, but I think that framing is really interesting in what you're saying. Basically, these families, given the circumstance of being in the military, may have very few options and providers. And so even more so, the onus is on the provider to learn different tactics and to have those options to present to families to help them create a parenting plan and a family plan that's actually going to work for them.
And I know we don't have a ton of time, but I would like to kind of walk through the how, not just the what. so that people have something at the end that they might begin to at least structuring their way. And so when I talk to parents, I say, if we're going to do an overall mission, what's really important is to identify what your mission is. Your mission as parents is to grow people up. But what does that really look like? What is that specifically? And if you think about two parents as being, say, two companies in a battalion, two subunits in a larger, if they are working with two goals, two sets of goals, or two sets of tactics, or two sets of values or standards of behavior, their parental mission is going to be undermined by their lack of cohesion in their effort. And so ultimately what we want to do is seal that together in an intentional way so that they can be more aligned while working with their kids. Obviously, that then becomes translated into parental consistency of tactic and approach. But if you say that, they're going to say, what the heck? My spouse has got to stay at home and take care of the kids. I'm not going to think about it. Well, then you're undermining your message that your spouse is giving by not being aligned. And so how do you do that? So if we frame them as a unit that they need to be able to communicate efficiently together, we have to be clear and organized around what are your values that you share, not what you don't share. So that's a task to give them. That is like, what are your shared values? What joined you together as parents? What do you want to accomplish together, not what you are individually interested in? Also then, based on those values, what are your clear standards of behavior, not just for your kids, but for yourself, so that the values are consistent and you can model them within a social emotional way, not just demand that kids live up to those, but you live up to them yourself. Because that's what the Army is, the Navy. We have standards of behavior for everyone. And so that's a nice way to implement some consistency and also decrease that likelihood of hypocrisy being taught by parents.
Right.
So if you have values and standards of behavior, then you clarify your mission by asking and having the parents clarify in their mind, what kind of a person do you want your children to be when they're 18? And once they have done that, then you have developed your strategic goal. That's your goal, to develop people that will be that way. So then you develop a battle plan to address whatever you're dealing with right now that is deviating you from having kids be the way you want them to be when they're 18. And that battle plan then allows you to choose tactics that are appropriate and consistent with your standards of behavior, consistent with your values, and that consistently allow you to teach or coach those things through all the transitions that you are.
I can hear the effectiveness in the way you're talking about, the way you're presenting it, because for most parents, parenting is extremely challenging. And so you're basically framing it in a way that externalizes it and takes the pressure off of the parent or of the couple, and just here's the mission. How do we achieve the mission? And that externalization makes it less personal, less it's bad when I yell or whatever it is. It makes it more like, but it's not consistent with the mission. And I think that kind of narrative, particularly for military families, may be really, really effective.
And I think what it does is that there are some not so great tactics like yelling that in the moment might work partially. Oh, I yelled at my kid. I got their attention. They paid attention to me. They knew I was serious. But if they, over time, learn that you're only serious when you yell, that then becomes the pattern, that you've taught them to ignore you because you're yelling. And so then if I can talk about that even though a tactic might work in the moment, like throwing a grenade into a home might work to take care of a threat. But if you killed a child when you did that inadvertently, you've undermined a larger issue. So a tactic may work for one part of a mission, but not all of it. And so what you want to do is create more efficiency in your choice of tactic. And the way to do that is to see how it aligns with your overall larger strategic plan and goal.
What you've outlined here is remarkably simple. But I think in the simplicity, it makes it reachable.
And that's what I've learned in all the times that I've done and sat in mandatory military trainings about anything, is breaking it down and making it as teachable as possible so that it is also usable when you need it, so that you have a way of making a decision on the fly, so that you know what your foundation is and that you know what your parameters are, but yet you can still improvise within it. And that's ultimately what I think knowing your values and being clear about them, knowing what your standards of behavior and being clear about them, and knowing what you want to teach and being clear about them allows you to function in the moment.
And I can also hear, I'm guessing as you talk about this, that it gives you an in to address some issues that, as you said, like may interfere with the successful completion of a mission. So not seeking treatment for a child's mental health problem or for neurodiversity, or being heavy-handed with a child and the drawbacks of doing that. And like you said about yelling, like what works in the short term but is actually detrimental in the long term, that framework being really beneficial.
I found it so. I found many more skeptical military members come in and be turned by the use of this framework, because then all of a sudden they can see, they can be self-reflective. Military members are self-reflective about their actions all the time. They just aren't trained to be self-reflective about personal matters. So if you frame it in a way that this is your mission, then it gives them I can be self-reflective. I want to be effective. I want to do this well. They don't want to be a failure. Well, what parent does? But when a mission is no fail in the military, they spend tons of time training. And after every iteration of training, they are doing what's called after-action reports or hot washes to review what worked, what didn't. And that is a daily task. It's very consistent with feedback-informed treatment in the sense that you have session rating scales, and I call that in my informed consent process, I say we do hot washes at the end of sessions. I don't call it feedback for therapeutic alliance. I call it they're hot washes. They're little AARs out after every session. And I go, okay. And it's a quick way to establish a feedback loop within that, because they're used to thinking critically about how an event occurred.
This is so interesting to me, and I think so, just digestible. It's really teachable in its simplicity. Doctor, how do people get in touch with you? So again, for our listeners, this is Dr. Alan Scheuermann, and he's joining us today from Guam. So he's not going to pop in and do a training in Los Angeles, I don't think, anytime soon. But how do people get in touch with you and learn more about your work? And what are some of the resources that you recommend to clinicians that are doing this kind of work?
So how to get in touch with me, I do have a LinkedIn profile. It's you'll list it, I believe,
yes.
on my thing. So please just look to the information on the course on Clearly Clinical for that. I would encourage people to really check in with Military Child Education Coalition. They do a ton of work with regard to helping transitions from military. It's often school focused because that's one of the biggest challenges of transitioning from one school to another, but they do a lot of support, have lots of good information there. Look at the references that I've listed. I really do and have found valuable Lynn Hall's book on counseling military families. It really gets into a lot of the guts of the background. While it is a bit dated, it's probably 15 years old. It's still very relevant as far as good information. That is in the resources. Do know that military families have tons of resources available to them, so familiarize yourself to start with militaryonesource.org. You can Google Military One Source, and that is a kind of a clearinghouse reference for families, parents, military-connected individuals to contact and get a sense of what resources are available to them in their area. as well as if they're transitioning to a new area, they could ask for assistance there. They can get referrals for providers. But you as a provider could call them up and just ask some questions as well about what's available to military providers, military families.
Thank you. I think this has been so helpful, and there's obviously so much more that needs to be said on this topic, but I think you just outlined a framework and kind of set the stage for how to do this and how to conceptualize it. Again, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Scheuermann. It's been really a delight to spend this time with you, and thank you also for your service.
Thanks a lot. All credit goes to the folks who are actually putting their lives on the line. I just listen to them and support them the best I can. But absolutely a pleasure to have this conversation with you as well.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.